The heat was a physical thing, a weight that settled in the lungs and pressed the dust of the street into a fine, baked sheet. From the deep shadow of the smithy, Silas watched the world through the shimmer of it, the air a liquid lens that distorted the already wavering lines of the dry goods store and the saloon across the way. His hammer was silent, resting on the anvil where it had last fallen, its steel head still holding a deep, resonant warmth that bled into the cooling iron of the horseshoe beneath it. For hours, the only sounds had been the buzz of a persistent fly and the creak of the saloon doors as men slipped out of the sun and into the manufactured twilight within, their thirst a more urgent need than any work the day might hold. Silas was a man made of stillness, his large frame settled onto a low stool in a way that suggested he had grown there, a part of the soot-stained timbers and the hard-packed earth of the floor. His hands, resting on his knees, were a map of his life, the palms thick with callus and the knuckles scarred with old burns and the fine white lines of careless cuts, each one a memory of metal made compliant. He did not move often, and when he did, it was with a deliberation that conserved every ounce of effort, a habit learned from years of working alone under a sun that gave no quarter. He would spend a long time afterward wondering what it was that first drew his eye, what small disturbance in the dead air of the afternoon made him lift his head from the contemplation of the cooling shoe. It was not a sound, for the town was sunk in its usual stupor, but a change in the light, a new shape moving at the far end of the street where the trail from the east bled into the town's only real thoroughfare. A wagon. It was a common enough sight, but this one was different, its canvas cover torn and its progress slow, pulled by two horses whose ribs showed plain even at this distance, their heads hung low as if in prayer for the end of the road. He watched it crawl forward, the wheels kicking up lazy plumes of dust that hung in the air long after the wagon had passed, a slow motion haunting. There were two women on the driver's bench, one older, holding the reins with a tight, desperate grip, and one younger, a girl, really, sitting perfectly straight beside her, her hands folded in her lap. Silas felt a familiar tightening in his gut, the instinct of a man who has learned that travelers arriving in such a state are often running from something, and that the thing they are running from is almost always just a day or two behind them, moving at a much steadier pace. He picked up his hammer. The rhythm of the work was a comfort, a way to measure time in something other than rising heat and lengthening shadows. The ring of steel on steel was a clean sound in the thick air, a declaration of purpose. He did not need to look up again to know when the wagon stopped. The silence told him. Afternoon. The wagon had pulled up in front of the mercantile, a place of false hope where credit was a word spoken only in whispers and usually followed by a slow, regretful shake of the head. The older woman climbed down, her movements stiff and clumsy with exhaustion, and she began a low, urgent negotiation with Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, who stood in his doorway with his arms crossed, his face a mask of practiced refusal. The girl remained on the bench unmoving, her gaze fixed on some point far beyond the town, beyond the flat, scorched horizon. She wore a plain dress of faded calico and a bonnet that hid most of her face, but a stray strand of dark hair had escaped and lay plastered to her temple with sweat. From his doorway, Silas could see the fine tremor in the older woman's hands as she pleaded, and he could see the way Henderson's eyes kept flicking past her, toward the girl on the wagon. It was a look he knew well. It was the look of a man calculating value, weighing assets, and finding the human element to be the least of his concerns. The town was beginning to stir, drawn out by the small drama. A few men drifted out of the saloon, squinting in the sudden glare, their curiosity piqued. Mrs. Gable, the boarding-house owner, appeared on her porch, fanning herself with a folded newspaper, her eyes missing nothing. They were vultures of a sort, not of flesh, but of misfortune, gathering to watch the slow, inevitable dismantling of someone else's life. Then another man appeared, and the atmosphere on the street shifted, the lazy curiosity curdling into something more focused, more tense. Mr. Sterling. He emerged from the hotel, dressed in a black coat and hat that seemed to absorb the sunlight and give none of it back, his boots polished to a high gleam that was an insult to the dust they trod upon. He was not a native of this place. He was a man who owned things, land and cattle, and, it was sometimes said, people. His smile was a thin, bloodless line, and it was directed at the wagon. He moved with a slow, predatory grace, his presence silencing the low murmurs of the onlookers. He tipped his hat to Mrs. Gable, a gesture of pure theater, and then his attention settled fully on the two women. The older one, the stepmother, saw him, and a new kind of fear, sharper than the fear of poverty, seized her face. She took a half-step back toward the wagon, as if to shield it, as if to shield the girl. "Don't let him see her," she hissed, a sound so low it was barely a breath, meant only for the girl herself. But in the dead stillness of the afternoon, the words seemed to carry all the way to Silas's forge. He was already watching. Sterling approached the wagon not with a predator's rush, but with the unhurried confidence of a man inspecting his own property. He ignored the stepmother completely, his gaze fixed on the girl, Alara, though Silas did not yet know her name. He walked a slow circle around the dilapidated wagon and the exhausted horses, his eyes cataloging every flaw, every sign of desperation. The onlookers remained silent, a passive chorus to a play they had seen before in different forms. They knew Sterling, and they knew what he wanted was always, eventually, his. He stopped before the horses, running a gloved hand down the flank of the nearest one, feeling the protruding ribs beneath the hide. "Tired animals," he said, his voice smooth and reasonable, carrying easily in the still air. It was not addressed to anyone in particular, but the stepmother flinched as if struck. "They've come a long way," she said, her voice thin and reedy. Sterling finally turned his eyes to her, a flicker of cold amusement in them. "Everything comes a long way to get here. The question is whether it was worth the journey." His gaze slid back to the girl on the bench. She had not moved, had not looked at him. She seemed a creature of stone, a small, still effigy of endurance. He saw the worn-out bonnet, the cheap dress, but he also saw the straightness of her spine, the way she held her head. There was something in her stillness that was not submission. Silas watched the man's eyes, the slight narrowing as he took in the details. He was a collector, and he had spotted something unbroken in the midst of all this ruin. "I have a need for a steady hand at my stables," Sterling said, his voice taking on a magnanimous tone, "someone to mind the stock, a girl with a gentle touch, perhaps." He was speaking to the stepmother, but his offer was a cage being built around the silent figure on the wagon. The stepmother's fear was now visibly at war with a dawning, terrible flicker of hope. She saw a way out, a transaction that would save her own skin. The price was not hers to pay. She's not for work," the woman stammered, a weak protest that was already a negotiation. Sterling smiled his thin smile. "Everything is for something, madam. It is the way of the world. I will provide for her room and board. I will purchase your horses at a fair price, and you will have enough to see you on your way. A good deal for all concerned." He made it sound like charity. It sounded like a death sentence. Silas felt the familiar heat of the forge behind him, but a different kind of heat was building in his chest. He saw the stepmother's resolve crumbling, her eyes darting between Sterling's impassive face and the promise of a few silver dollars. She was going to sell her. The stepmother was on the verge of accepting. Her shoulders slumped in a gesture that was part defeat and part relief, the terrible calculus of her own survival overriding everything else. She opened her mouth to speak, to seal the bargain that would trade the girl's future for a few days' journey to the next desperate town. The men from the saloon watched with a detached interest, as if it were a card game. Mrs. Gable fanned herself a little faster, her expression unreadable. No one would intervene. This was the way of things, the strong taking what they wanted from the weak, and the rest of the world looking on, grateful it was not their turn. Just as the woman was about to speak the word, Silas moved. He did not stride out with purpose. He simply set his hammer down on the anvil with a soft, definitive clang, the sound small but sharp in the thick silence. He wiped his hands on a rag, a slow, methodical gesture, and then walked out of the deep shadow of his forge and into the blinding sun. He did not look at Sterling. He did not look at the girl. He walked directly to the front of the wagon, his eyes on the cracked axle and the splintered wood of the left wheel. He moved with the quiet economy of a man who knows his own strength and feels no need to advertise it. The sun beat down on his bare head and the dark fabric of his shirt, and for a moment he just stood there, squinting at the damaged wheel as if it were the only thing of consequence in the entire world. The stepmother faltered, her words dying in her throat. Sterling turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing at this unexpected interruption. He did not know Silas well. Few people did. He knew him only as the blacksmith, a fixture of the town as unremarkable as the water trough or the hitching posts. A tool. And tools did not interfere. "You have business here, Smith?" Sterling's voice was soft, but the question was edged with steel. Silas did not answer him directly. He crouched down, running one of his large, calloused hands over the fractured wood of the wheel. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a diagnostician's touch. "This wheel won't see another 10 miles, he said, his voice a low rumble, directed at the stepmother. "The axles cracked through. Hit a bad rut, I'd wager." He spoke of wood and iron, of practical problems that had practical solutions. But his action was a wall, a sudden physical barrier thrown into the middle of Sterling's transaction. He had changed the subject from human flesh to splintered oak. He had bought time, a few seconds, a minute. He did not know what he would do with it, only that the silence had become unbearable, and he had to fill it with the solid, honest weight of his trade. He had to fix what was broken. Sterling watched Silas with a cold, appraising stillness. The blacksmith's interruption was an anomaly, a piece on the board moving in a way it was not supposed to. It was a challenge, however small and indirect, and Sterling was a man who did not tolerate challenges. He let the silence stretch, forcing Silas to be the next one to speak, to reveal his purpose. But Silas said nothing more. He remained crouched by the wheel, his broad back to Sterling, his attention seemingly devoted entirely to the problem of the failing axle. He was giving the stepmother an out, a reason to delay, a practical problem that needed solving before any other business could be concluded. The woman, however, was too lost in her own fear and desperation to see it. She saw only another obstacle, another expense. "We have no money for repairs," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "None at all." It was an admission of total defeat, and it handed all the power back to Sterling. He smiled, a slow, predator's smile. "It seems your journey has reached its end here," he said, his voice once again smooth and final. He took a step toward the wagon, his hand outstretched, not toward the girl, but toward the reins, a gesture of ownership. "The deal stands. I will take the girl and the horses. The wagon is worthless, but you may have it. A gift." He was closing the trap. The town watched. They saw a rich man offering a solution, and a blacksmith kneeling in the dust, meddling in things that were not his concern. Their sympathies, such as they were, lay with the established order of things. Silas knew this. He had lived his whole life on the edge of this town, observing its currents, its casual cruelties. He knew that to oppose Sterling directly was to invite a kind of trouble that did not end quickly or cleanly. He could feel the weight of every eye on his back. He stayed where he was for another long moment, his hand resting on the broken wheel. He thought of all the things he had mended in his life: plows, gates, hinges, tools. He had always worked with iron, a material that was honest in its nature. It was hard, it was unyielding, but with enough heat and enough force, it would bend to a new shape. It could be made useful again. People were not like iron. He rose slowly to his feet, turning at last to face Sterling. He did not look angry. He did not look afraid. He looked tired, as if the heat of the day had finally settled deep into his bones. "I'll do the work on credit," Silas said, his gaze steady. "The wheel and the axle. She can work it off." He nodded his head just once in the direction of the silent girl on the wagon. "She can work for me." The words fell into the street with the weight of stones thrown into a still pond. The silence that followed was different now, charged with a stunned disbelief. No one spoke. Sterling's smile vanished, replaced by a flat, cold blankness. The stepmother stared at Silas as if he had lost his mind, her face a comical mask of confusion and suspicion. The onlookers shifted on their feet, murmuring to one another. The blacksmith, the quiet man who kept to himself, had just made a public bid. He had countered Sterling's offer of possession with an offer of work, of wages, of dignity. It was an act of such quiet, insane defiance that for a moment no one knew how to react. Sterling was the first to recover. A low, humorless chuckle escaped his lips. "You, Smith, what use would you have for her? Your anvil doesn't need a gentle touch. You live alone. You work alone. This is not your affair." The threat was clear. Return to your forge, to your proper place. Silas did not rise to the bait. He held Sterling's gaze, his own expression unchanging. "I have ledgers that need keeping, supplies to be inventoried. The forge needs sweeping. There's work enough." He was listing chores, simple and plain. He was building a wall of practicalities, of mundane tasks that stood in stark opposition to the unspoken, predatory nature of Sterling's offer. He was offering a job, not a cage. The stepmother finally found her voice. "Work? For what wage?" she demanded, her mind immediately seizing on the financial aspect of this new development. She saw the girl not as a person to be saved, but as an asset whose value had just been disputed. "The standard rate," Silas said, not looking at her. "Paid to her. She can pay you for her passage here, if that's what's owed." He had done it again. With a few simple words, he had reframed the entire situation. He had given the girl agency, a debt she could repay, a wage she could earn. He had made her a person, not an object to be bought and sold. He had made her free. For the first time, the girl on the wagon moved. She turned her head slowly and looked at Silas. Her bonnet had slipped back, and he could see her face clearly. She was younger than he had thought, and there was a thin, faded scar that cut through one eyebrow, giving her a perpetually serious expression. Her eyes were not fearful. They were intelligent, and they were weary. She was looking at him not with gratitude, but with the same careful, appraising consideration that he had given the broken wheel. She was weighing his offer. She was measuring the man. And in that long, silent gaze, Silas felt the weight of his promise settle upon him. It was a heavier thing than any iron he had ever lifted. Sterling understood he was being outmaneuvered, not by force, but by the slow, grinding power of public perception. To insist now, to use his wealth and influence to override the blacksmith's offer of honest work, would be to reveal the very nature he sought to conceal beneath a veneer of civilized transactions. The town was watching, and while they would not have lifted a finger to stop him from taking the girl, they would whisper about it afterward if his methods were too crude, too blatant. His reputation, his control, was built on the careful maintenance of that veneer. He could not afford to be seen as a common bully, not when the pretense of being a benefactor was so much more effective. His face hardened, the mask of polite society slipping to reveal the cold anger beneath. He looked from Silas's implacable expression to the girl's steady gaze, and he knew he had lost this skirmish. But the war was not over. "An interesting proposition, Smith," Sterling said, his voice dangerously soft. "To take on a stray. You are a more charitable man than I imagined." He let the word stray hang in the air, an insult meant to diminish them both. But charity has a cost. Remember that. He gave Silas one last lingering look, a look that promised consequences, a future accounting for this day's insolence. Then he turned on his heel, his polished boots making sharp, angry sounds in the dust, and walked back toward the hotel without a backward glance. He had been denied. The tension on the street broke like a fever. The show was over. The men from the saloon drifted back inside, already arguing about what they had just seen. Mrs. Gable gave a final decisive snap of her fan and disappeared into her boarding house. The world was returning to its normal shape. The stepmother, however, was now faced with a new reality. Her quick salvation had vanished, replaced by a complication. She looked at Silas with open hostility. "What have you done?" she hissed. He would have paid well. "He would have owned her," Silas said, his voice flat. He turned his back on the woman and looked up at the girl. "Alara, the work is real," he said, "and it will be hard. The choice is yours." He did not offer her kindness or pity. He offered her the same hard, unyielding terms he offered the world, a fair exchange, labor for a life. The stepmother scoffed. "She has no choice. She comes with me." Alara looked from her stepmother's angry, frightened face to the blacksmith's steady one. She saw the forge behind him, a dark mouth of shadow and heat, a place of hard work and fire. It was a forbidding place, but it was not a cage. She made her decision. Slowly, deliberately, she began to climb down from the wagon. Days later, the broken wagon was gone. The stepmother, after a night of bitter recriminations and a final failed attempt to claim some payment from Silas, had taken what little he offered for the exhausted horses and had bought a seat on the morning stage, disappearing from their lives as abruptly as she had arrived. She left without a word of farewell to the girl she had raised. Alara remained. The town watched her, of course, their curiosity undiminished. They saw her sweep the dust and soot from the front of the smithy each morning. They saw her carry buckets of water from the well, her back straight, her steps measured. They saw her sit on a stool just inside the doorway of the forge, mending her own worn dress with a needle and thread, her movements small and precise. They whispered among themselves. They wondered what Silas was thinking, taking in a girl with a scar on her face and no family to speak for her. They waited for the arrangement to fail, for her to run off or for him to cast her out, but she did not run, and he did not cast her out. The rhythm of the forge changed. It was no longer a solitary beat. There was the soft whisk of her broom against the hard-packed earth, the scrape of a bucket, the quiet presence of another person breathing in the same superheated air. Silas worked at his anvil, the familiar ring of his hammer, a constant bass note to the new, softer sounds of her life. He did not speak to her much in those first days, and she remained equally silent. Their communication was in action. He would leave a plate of food for her on the small table at the back of the forge, and when he returned, the plate would be clean. She would refill the water barrel for quenching the hot iron without being asked, anticipating the need. It was a slow, careful dance of two solitary people learning the shape of a shared space. He discovered things about her not through words, but through observation. He noticed that she organized his scattered tools, arranging the tongs and hammers by size and function, until they lay in neat, orderly rows he could find in the dim light without looking. He noticed that when a customer came to pay, she would watch from the shadows, her eyes following the exchange of coin, her lips moving silently as if she were calculating the figures in her head. One afternoon, he came back from delivering a set of new hinges to find her standing over his ledger, a book of chaotic scrawls and forgotten debts. She had a piece of charcoal in her hand, and she was not looking at the numbers, but at the empty page beside them. She was drawing. With a few deft strokes, she had sketched the head of a horse, not one of the broken-down creatures from the wagon, but a proud, noble animal, its eye intelligent, its mane seeming to move on the page. The lines were clean and confident, full of a life that belied the cheap paper and the crude charcoal. He stood in the doorway for a long time, just watching her hand move. He had offered her a job sweeping floors. He was beginning to understand he had found something far more valuable. He had found an artist, weeks later. The initial curiosity of the town had faded, replaced by a grudging acceptance. The girl at the smithy was now just another part of the landscape. They saw her less often, as she spent more of her time inside the forge, but the evidence of her presence was everywhere. The chaotic pile of scrap iron behind the smithy was now sorted into neat stacks by size and type. The sign that hung over the door, once faded and barely legible, had been taken down, sanded smooth, and repainted with letters so sharp and clear they seemed to have been cut from new iron. Silas had watched her do it, her hand steady, her eye for spacing perfect. He had paid her for the work, placing the coins in her hand, and she'd accepted them with a quiet nod, her eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second longer than usual. A new kind of communication was growing between them, a language of shared work. He learned that she saw the world in shapes and forms, in possibilities. He would be struggling with a design for a complex piece of decorative ironwork, a gate for the new church, and she would silently take a piece of charcoal and sketch a curve, a spiral, a leaf, on a piece of scrap wood, her drawing simpler and more elegant than anything he had conceived. She never offered it as a correction, only as a thought, leaving the drawing where he could find it. He began to incorporate her designs into his work, the rigid, functional lines of his craft softening with an artistry that had never been there before. His work, already respected for its strength, began to be known for its beauty. People started coming from other towns, seeking out the blacksmith whose gates looked like woven vines and whose window grills held the patterns of frost on a winter morning. Sterling was a constant, unspoken presence. He would sometimes ride past the forge, his horse's hooves deliberately slow, his gaze sweeping over the building, lingering on the open doorway where Alara might be working. He never stopped. He never spoke. But his presence was a reminder, a promise of an unfinished story. Silas felt it every time, a cold knot in the pit of his stomach. He had not defeated the man. He had only delayed him. He had taken on a responsibility, and the weight of it was with him always. One evening, as the sun was setting and the forge was cooling, he found Alara by the water trough, washing the soot from her hands and face. The scar above her eye was a pale silver line in the fading light. He had never asked her about it. He had never asked her about anything before she arrived in this town. Her past was her own, just as his was his. He handed her a clean rag, and she took it. "The design for the church gate," he said, his voice rough. "It's good work." It was the closest he had ever come to a compliment. She looked down at the rag in her hands, then back up at him. "You made it real," she said softly. "The drawing is just a shadow. You gave it weight." They stood in silence for a moment, the first stars beginning to appear in the deep purple sky. The air was cooling, carrying the scent of dust and wood smoke. For the first time, Silas felt the forge not as his solitary domain, but as a home. It was a fragile thing, this peace they had built, a small circle of light in a vast darkness. He knew Sterling was out there, in that darkness, waiting. He knew this was not an ending. It was a beginning, and it would have to be defended. That night, the heat did not break. A dry wind rose instead, rattling the loose shutters on the mercantile and carrying the mournful sound of a distant coyote. Silas lay on his cot at the back of the smithy, but he did not sleep. The wind sounded like whispers, like warnings. He thought of Sterling's face, the cold promise in his eyes. He had lived his life by a simple code: mind his own business, do his work, and expect nothing from anyone. He had built his world around a core of solitude, believing it was a fortress. But Alara's arrival had breached those walls, not with force, but with her quiet competence, her unexpected artistry. She had brought a different kind of strength into his world, and in protecting her, he had made himself vulnerable for the first time in years. He thought of the scar on her face, and wondered at the story it told, a story of survival he knew he had no right to ask for. He had offered her a job, a simple transaction, but it had become something more. He felt a sense of ownership that was different from Sterling's, not the ownership of a collector for an object, but the fierce, protective responsibility of a man who has found something of worth and knows its value to the world. He rose from his cot and walked to the front of the forge, looking out into the moonlit street. The town was asleep, a collection of dark, silent shapes. It was easy to feel alone out here, to believe that any fight would be his and his alone. The wind gusted, kicking up a swirl of dust that looked like a ghost dancing in the moonlight. He was not a young man anymore. The strength in his arms was still there, forged by years of swinging a hammer, but he knew Sterling's power was of a different kind. It was the power of money, of influence, of a world that bent to the will of men like him. His own power was small, contained within the four walls of his forge. It was the power to make, to mend, to create. He wondered if it would be enough. He heard a small sound behind him, and turned. Alara was standing in the shadows, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She had not been sleeping either. She looked at him, her eyes accustomed to the dark, and there was no fear in them. There was only a quiet understanding, as if she could hear the same warnings in the wind that he did. "He won't give up," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. No, Silas agreed. Men like him never do. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper above the sound of the wind. Silas looked out at the empty street, at the sleeping town that would not help him. He looked at the tools of his trade, hanging in their neat, orderly rows. He looked at her, this girl who had arrived in a broken wagon and had somehow begun to mend his own broken world. He felt the weight of the hammer in his memory, the solid, satisfying impact of steel shaping steel. He had spent his life forcing iron to his will. He would not be bent by this man. He would not break. "I will do my work," he said, and in the simple, honest truth of those words he found his answer. He would stand his ground. He would protect his forge. He would protect her, not with violence, but with the steady, unyielding power of his purpose. He would continue to build. He would continue to create, and he would see which force was stronger in the end, the one that takes or the one that makes. The wind howled, but inside the forge it was suddenly very still. Thank you for being here, for staying with this story until the very end. We all have moments where we see an injustice, large or small, playing out in front of us. We see someone being underestimated, dismissed, or treated as less than they are. And in those moments, we face a choice. Do we stay in the shadows where it's safe and tell ourselves it's not our affair? Or do we step out into the sun and offer what we can? Not a grand gesture, not a heroic rescue, but a simple, decent offer of work, of respect, of seeing the value in another human being. The world is full of people who will tell you to look away. But what happens when we choose, instead, to look closer? What strength do we find, not just in others, but in ourselves, when we decide to mend what is broken? If this story meant something to you, we'd be grateful if you'd like and subscribe. Your support is what allows us to keep the forge lit. We'll see you again.